Jake Morrison stepped through the sliding doors of classroom 47B and felt every conversation stop. The silence was thick and heavy, like walking into a library during finals week back on Earth. But this wasn't Earth, and this wasn't a library. This was Kepler Prime, home to the most famous university in the galaxy, and Jake was the only human in a room full of aliens who looked at him like he might eat them for lunch. The classroom was unlike anything Jake had seen before. The ceiling stretched up into a dome shape, painted with swirling colors that seemed to move on their own. Along the walls, different sections had been built for different types of students. Some areas had thick glass bubbles filled with orange gas. Others had shallow pools of purple liquid. A few spots had what looked like giant flower pots filled with rich, dark soil. Jake's section was simple compared to the others. Just regular chairs and desks, the kind he might find back home. The air around his area smelled normal too, not like the sweet flower scent that drifted from the plant student section, or the metallic tang that came from where the robot-looking students sat. He picked a seat in the middle row and set down his backpack. The bag made a soft thud on the floor, and somehow that small sound made several students jump. A creature that looked like a walking flower turned all its petals toward him, then quickly looked away. Near the gas-filled bubbles, something that might have been made of living crystal started glowing brighter, which Jake guessed meant it was nervous. "Good morning, class," came a voice that sounded like wind chimes mixed with a computer. Jake looked up to see Professor Vexhar gliding into the room. The professor was tall and thin, made of what looked like living glass that changed colors as it moved. Where a human would have a face, Professor Vexhar had a cluster of small lights that pulsed when it spoke. "I am Professor Vexhar, and this is Xenobiology 101. For those new to the subject, xenobiology is the study of life forms from different worlds and how they interact with each other." The professor's lights flickered in what might have been a smile. "We have a very diverse class this semester, which will make our studies even more interesting." Jake noticed how the professor's voice got a little higher when it said diverse. Everyone knew that was code for "we have a human in class and everyone is scared." A student near the front raised what looked like a tentacle. It was green and slimy with small eyes at the tip. "Professor, is it safe to have a deathworlder in class with us?" Jake sighed quietly. He had heard that word a lot since arriving at the university. Deathworlder. It was what the other species called humans and anyone else who came from what they considered dangerous planets. Earth, with its extreme weather, violent animals, and deadly diseases, was at the top of their list of worlds they never wanted to visit. "An excellent question, Glix," Professor Vexhar said to the tentacled student. "This brings us to our first lesson about predator and prey relationships in nature. Many of you come from what we call garden worlds, planets where life is peaceful, and cooperation is the main way species survive." The professor moved to the center of the room, where a large circular platform was built into the floor. On garden worlds, most creatures are herbivores, eating plants, or they filter feed, taking nutrients from water or air. Conflict is rare because there is usually enough food for everyone. Jake looked around and saw his classmates nodding. The flower student, who he thought might be named Rose based on her name tag, swayed gently in agreement. Near the pools, a student that looked like a jellyfish with arms bobbed up and down. "But some worlds are different," the professor continued. "On these worlds, life is more competitive. Resources are limited, weather is harsh, and creatures must fight to survive. We call these death worlds not because they are evil, but because they create very different types of life forms." All eyes turned to Jake again. He tried to look friendly and non-threatening, but he wasn't sure it was working. Back home, his mom always said he had kind eyes, but apparently that didn't translate well to alien species. "Humans," Professor Vexhar said, "evolved on what might be the most competitive world we have studied. Earth has extreme temperatures, violent weather, poisonous plants, and predators that would terrify most civilized species. To survive there, humans developed very specific traits." Jake shifted in his seat. He knew what was coming next. Humans are persistence hunters, They can chase prey for hours without stopping. They have excellent eyesight for tracking, strong muscles for fighting, and most importantly, they are problem solvers. When faced with a threat, instead of running or hiding like most prey species, humans think of ways to eliminate the threat. A student near the back made a sound like a tea kettle whistling. Jake thought that might be their species' way of showing fear. However, the professor continued, and Jake heard the relief in some of his classmates' breathing. Humans also evolved. Strong social bonds. They protect members of their group even at great personal cost. This makes them excellent allies, even if they are formidable opponents. Rose, the flower student, turned slightly toward Jake. Her voice was soft and musical when she spoke. Is it true that humans can eat almost anything? Jake nodded. Pretty much. We evolved to be omnivores because we never knew what food would be available. If plants were scarce, we could hunt. If animals were scarce, we could gather fruits and vegetables. We can even eat things that are poisonous to most other species. A collective shudder went through the room. But I mostly eat pizza and sandwiches, Jake added, trying to lighten the mood. Just like you probably have favorite foods too. Some of the tension seemed to ease. A student that looked like a giant butterfly fluttered its wings in what might have been laughter. Professor Vexhar's lights pulsed approvingly. Excellent point, Jake. This brings us to today's practical lesson. Understanding predator-prey relationships is not just about theory. Today we will observe a real predator in a controlled environment. The professor moved to a control panel near the platform. I want everyone to observe not just the predator, but your own reactions to it. How do your bodies respond to the presence of a hunter? What instincts activate? This will help you understand the biological basis of interspecies relationships. Jake noticed several students moving their chairs back from the platform. Rose's petals started to curl inward, which he guessed was her species' defensive response. The jellyfish student sank lower in its pool. Do not worry, Professor Vexhar assured them. The creature will be contained within a force field. You are perfectly safe. The professor's lights flickered as it began entering commands into the control panel. Today's subject is a Cathera stalker, a mid-level predator from the wilderness worlds. It hunts creatures similar in size and biology to many of you, so your reaction should be quite strong. Jake pulled out his notebook and pen, ready to take notes. Around him, his classmates were activating personal shields, moving to the edges of the room, or in the case of one student who looked like a small tree, actually putting down roots into the floor. The platform in the center of the room began to glow, and Jake could hear a humming sound as the containment field activated. Whatever was about to appear, his classmates were already terrified of it. Jake found himself curious to see what all the fuss was about. Back on Earth, his high school biology class had dissected frogs. Something told him this was going to be a lot more interesting. The air in the classroom changed the moment the creature appeared. Jake felt it like a shift in pressure, the way the atmosphere felt heavy before a thunderstorm back home. But while Jake simply looked up from his notebook with interest, the reaction from his classmates was immediate and dramatic. The Cathera stalker materialized inside the glowing containment field like something from a nightmare. It stood about 4 feet tall at the shoulder, with a lean, muscular body covered in dark scales that seemed to absorb light. Its head was elongated, filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth that dripped with saliva that hissed when it hit the platform floor. 6 legs ended in claws that looked like they could cut through steel, and its eyes were solid black, scanning the room with predatory intelligence. Rose, the flower student, let out a sound like wind through dying leaves and immediately wilted. Her bright petals folded inward and her entire body seemed to shrink down toward her pot. The sweet scent that normally surrounded her turned bitter and sharp. What Jake guessed was her species' equivalent of cold sweat. Near the pools, the jellyfish student named Tide made a gurgling noise and sank completely underwater, leaving only a few tentacles visible at the surface. The gas-breathing students in their protective bubbles started flashing rapid colors, reds and oranges that probably meant panic in their language. Alex, the insect-like student from the Chitari colonies, began releasing pheromones so strongly that Jake could actually smell them. The scent was sharp and acidic, like burning rubber mixed with rotten eggs. Alex's entire body was shaking, and his compound eyes were fixed on the exits. "Fascinating," Professor Vexhar said, seemingly unaffected by the chaos among the students. "Notice how each species is displaying their evolved fear responses. The Althean student has activated defensive wilting. The aquatic collective member has sought deep water safety. The Chitauri is releasing distress pheromones to warn others of danger." Jake looked around and realized he was the only student still, sitting normally. Everyone else had either retreated to the walls, activated personal defense shields, or in the case of 3 students near the back, actually fainted and were lying unconscious on the floor. The stalker paced inside its containment field, testing the boundaries. When it pressed against the energy barrier, small sparks of electricity danced across its scales, but it didn't seem bothered by the pain. Its black eyes moved constantly, cataloging every student in the room like items on a menu. The Cathera. "Stalker," Professor Vexhar continued the lecture as if half the class wasn't in various states of panic, "is an ambush predator from the forest worlds of the Outer Rim. It typically hunts in packs of 3 to 5 individuals using coordination and intelligence to bring down prey much larger than themselves." The creature's head snapped toward Jake, and for a moment, predator and human made eye contact. Jake felt a small chill run down his spine. Not fear, exactly, but recognition. This was a serious predator, the kind of animal that could kill him if it got the chance. But instead of looking away or activating a panic response, Jake simply met its gaze steadily and continued taking notes. The stalker seemed confused by this reaction. Most prey animals either fled immediately or froze in terror when it looked at them directly. This strange bipedal creature just stared back with calm interest, occasionally looking down to write something, then returning its attention to the predator, like it was watching an interesting documentary. "Notice the hunting behaviors?" The professor said. "The stalker is evaluating potential prey, looking for signs of weakness, injury, or fear. It prefers targets that are already showing stress responses." As if to demonstrate this point, the creature turned toward Rose, who was still wilted and shaking. It pressed against the containment field in her direction, and she made that dying wind sound again, curling up even smaller. "The acidic saliva you can see dripping from its mouth serves 2 purposes," Professor Vexhar explained. "First, it begins breaking down the prey before consumption, making digestion easier. Second, the hissing sound it makes when hitting the ground serves as psychological warfare, increasing fear in potential victims." Several students were now openly crying, their various species versions of tears creating small puddles or colored mists around the room. Alex was clicking rapidly in what Jake recognized as his species' distress language, probably calling for help that would never come. The creature moved with liquid grace inside its prison, muscles rippling under dark scales. Jake found himself admiring its efficiency of design. Everything about the stalker was built for killing, from the way its joints were positioned for explosive speed, to the placement of its eyes for maximum depth perception, to the length of its claws for maximum damage. "In the wild," the professor continued, "a single stalker can take down prey 10 times its size if the victim panics and makes poor decisions. However, if faced with organized resistance or a creature that doesn't trigger its hunting instincts, the stalker becomes much less effective." Jake wrote that down, underlining it twice. It was interesting how many predators relied on fear as much as physical advantages. Back home, bears were similar, massive and dangerous, but they usually backed down if you stood your ground and made yourself look bigger instead of running. The stalker was growing more agitated as it watched the room. Most of the students were displaying perfect prey behavior. They were afraid, scattered, and focused on escape rather than defense. But one student was just sitting there, taking notes, completely unaffected by its presence. This was outside, the creature's experience. Suddenly, warning lights began flashing around the room. Professor Vexhar's crystalline body flickered rapidly between colors, which Jake guessed meant concern. "Students, please remain calm," the professor announced, but there was tension in the wind chime voice now. We are experiencing some technical difficulties with the containment system. Jake looked up from his notes to see that the energy field around the stalker was flickering. The steady blue glow was now pulsing irregularly, and small gaps were appearing and disappearing in the barrier. The creature noticed too. It stopped pacing and began testing the weak spots systematically, pressing against areas where the field seemed less stable. Its movements became more purposeful, less like a caged animal, and more like an escape artist working on a lock. "Professor," called out a student who looked like a walking crystal formation, "the containment field is failing." More warning lights activated, and an automated voice began speaking in several languages. Jake couldn't understand most of them, but he caught the basic meaning. Emergency protocols activated. Evacuation procedures in effect. The stalker pressed harder against a weak point in the barrier, and this time the energy field didn't push back. Its claw penetrated the barrier for just a second before the field reasserted itself, but that was enough. The creature had found its weakness. Rose let out a keening wail of terror. Alex's pheromone release intensified until the air filtration system was working overtime to clear the smell. Several more students fainted, and those who were conscious began pressing against the exit doors, but the doors weren't opening. "Emergency lockdown activated," the automated voice announced. "All exits sealed until threat is neutralized." Professor Vexhar was working frantically at the control panel, lights flashing so rapidly they were almost strobing. "Students, please, move to the emergency shelters at the back of the classroom. The lockdown is a safety precaution." The emergency shelters turned out to be small alcoves with additional shielding, designed to protect students from exactly this kind of situation. But there weren't enough of them for the whole class, and in the panic, the stronger students were pushing past the weaker ones. Jake watched this chaos with growing concern. Not for himself. He was reasonably confident he could handle one mid-sized predator if necessary. But his classmates were terrified, disorganized, and starting to hurt each other in their desperation to reach safety. The stalker found another weak point in the containment field and pressed both front claws against it. This time, the barrier held for several seconds before collapsing entirely. The creature was free. For a moment, everything was perfectly still. The stalker stood on the platform, no longer contained, scanning the room full of terrified prey animals. The students were frozen in terror, finally understanding that their worst fears were about to come true. Then the creature moved, and chaos erupted. The stalker leaped from the platform toward the densest group of students. Its target was clear: Rose, the Althean, who was too scared to move and too heavy to be pushed out of the way by her classmates. Jake Morrison stood up. The emergency lighting cast strange shadows across the classroom as the Kythera stalker crouched on the platform, free from its containment. Jake could see the creature's muscles bunching under its dark scales as it prepared to strike. Around him, his classmates were trapped between their terror of the predator and the sealed emergency doors that refused to open. Rose was directly in the creature's line of sight, her bright petals making her an obvious target against the neutral colors of the classroom walls. She had gone completely rigid with fear, her natural defensive response actually making her situation worse by preventing her from moving to safety. "The solar storm is interfering with all our systems," Professor Vexhar announced, working frantically at the control panel. The professor's crystalline body was flashing rapidly through different colors, which Jake had learned usually meant high stress in their species. "I cannot restore containment or open the emergency exits until the electromagnetic interference subsides." The stalker took a slow step forward, then another. It was being careful now, calculating. Jake recognized the behavior from nature documentaries about big cats back on Earth. The creature was selecting its target, planning its attack route, making sure it wouldn't miss when it made its move. Alex, the Chitauri student, was clicking frantically in his own language while backing toward the far wall. His pheromone release had reached the point where even Jake could feel his eyes starting to water from the chemical distress signals filling the air. Near the pools, tide had surfaced just enough to watch what was happening. But Jake could see. The jellyfish-like student was preparing to dive deep and stay underwater until the danger passed. That was probably smart for Tide, but it wouldn't help anyone else. The crystal student named Prism was glowing so brightly with fear that small rainbows were dancing on the walls around the classroom. Several of the smaller students had formed, a group near the back, huddling together in a way that might provide emotional comfort but made them a bigger target for a pack hunter like the stalker. "Students, please remain calm," Professor Vexhar said, but Jake could hear the uncertainty in the professor's wind chime voice. "Help is on the way. Campus security has been notified." Jake doubted help would arrive in time. The creature was done evaluating and was beginning its hunting approach. It moved with liquid silence across the classroom floor, placing each clawed foot carefully to avoid making noise that might alert its prey to the exact moment of attack. The stalker was now only about 15 feet from Rose, who still hadn't moved from her spot. Jake could see tears running down her bark-like skin, and she was making small whimpering sounds that reminded him of wind through autumn leaves. That was when the creature made its decision and launched itself forward. The stalker moved faster than Jake had expected, covering the distance to Rose in 2 powerful bounds. Its claws extended, its mouth opened to reveal those needle-sharp teeth, and its acidic saliva left a hissing trail through the air. Jake didn't think. He reacted. He threw himself sideways out of his chair, rolling across the floor and coming up directly between the stalker and Rose. The creature, already committed to its attack, couldn't change direction in mid-leap and slammed into Jake instead of its intended target. The impact knocked Jake backward into Rose's environmental station, sending potting soil and plant nutrients flying everywhere. The stalker landed hard on the classroom floor, stunned for a moment by the unexpected collision with something that wasn't supposed to be there. Jake rolled to his feet, putting himself firmly between the predator and the terrified plant student. His heart was racing now, not with fear but with adrenaline. This was a real fight, not a classroom demonstration, and every instinct his species had evolved over millions of years was suddenly wide awake. The stalker recovered quickly and turned its black eyes toward this new threat. Jake could see the, confusion in its expression. This wasn't how prey animals were supposed to behave. Prey ran away or froze in terror. They didn't throw themselves between predators and easier targets. "Jake, move," Professor Vexhar called out. "You cannot fight. That creature, it will kill you." But Jake was already shifting into a fighting stance his high school wrestling coach had taught him, modified for dealing with 4-legged opponents instead of 2-legged ones. He kept his center of gravity low, his arms spread wide to make himself look larger, and his eyes locked on the creature's center mass rather than its hypnotic gaze. The stalker circled to Jake's left, looking for an opening. Jake turned with it, keeping himself between the creature and Rose, who was now crying openly and trying to shrink even smaller into her pot. Around the classroom, Jake's other classmates were pressed against the walls, watching in horror as their Deathworlder classmate faced down a creature that could easily kill half of them. Some were recording the encounter with their various devices, probably thinking they were about to witness Jake's death and wanting to document how it happened. The creature feinted left, then lunged right, trying to get around Jake to reach the easier target. But Jake had played football in high school, and he knew how to read fake-outs and react to real attacks. He sidestepped the lunge and brought his elbow down hard on the creature's neck as it passed by. The blow wasn't enough to seriously hurt the stalker, but it was enough to get its attention. The creature spun around with a sound like tearing metal and focused entirely on Jake. Its black eyes were no longer calculating and cold. Now they were angry. "That's right," Jake said quietly, settling back into his defensive stance. "I'm the threat now. Forget about everyone else." The stalker began making a new sound, something like a cross between a growl and a hiss. Acidic saliva dripped more heavily from its mouth, and Jake could see small burns appearing on the floor, where the drops landed. This time the creature didn't bother with strategy or misdirection. It simply charged straight at Jake with all the speed and fury it could manage. Claws extended and teeth bared. Jake waited until the last possible second, then dropped and rolled to his right. The stalker's momentum carried it past him, and Jake came up behind the creature, grabbing it around the neck in a move that would have been called a sleeper hold if his opponent had been human. But the stalker wasn't human, and its neck was protected by thick scales and powerful muscles. Jake's grip slipped and the creature spun around, raking its claws across his left arm before he could get clear. Jake felt the burning pain as the claws cut through his jacket and into his skin, but he didn't let it slow him down. Pain was just information, his survival training instructor had always said. It told you that you were hurt, but it didn't tell you to stop fighting. The creature pressed its attack, slashing at Jake with both front claws while trying to bite him with those needle teeth. Jake gave ground, dodging and weaving, using his superior reach and mobility to stay just out of range of the worst attacks. But he was fighting a creature designed by evolution to kill things, and it was learning his patterns. The next time Jake tried to dodge left, the stalker anticipated the move and caught him across the chest with its claws, tearing his shirt and leaving 3 parallel cuts across his ribs. Jake stumbled backward, his vision blurring slightly from pain and blood loss. The creature sensed weakness and pressed forward, ready to finish what it had started. That was when Jake stopped retreating and did something that shocked everyone in the classroom, including the stalker itself. He roared. Not a yell or a shout, but a deep primal sound that came from somewhere in his chest, where millions of years of human evolution had stored the memory of what it meant to be an apex predator. It was the sound his ancestors had made when they faced down cave bears and saber-toothed tigers, the sound that said, "I am not prey." The stalker actually took a step backward, confused and uncertain for the first time since it had been freed from containment. In its experience, prey animals made sounds of fear and pain. They didn't make sounds of challenge and dominance. Jake advanced on the creature, still roaring, his arms spread wide and his posture aggressive. Blood was running down his arm and chest, but he moved forward like the wounds didn't matter, like pain was just another weapon in his arsenal. The stalker tried to stand its ground, but something in its primitive brain was sending warning signals it had never felt before. This wasn't prey behavior. This was the behavior of something even more dangerous than itself. For the first time since the containment field had failed, the balance of power in the classroom began to shift. The sound that came from Jake's chest was unlike anything his classmates had ever heard. It wasn't the high-pitched scream of a creature in terror, or the desperate wail of something about to die. This was something deeper, older, and infinitely more dangerous. It was the sound of a predator accepting a challenge. The Cathera stalker stopped moving entirely, its black eyes fixed on Jake with something that might have been confusion, or might have been the first stirrings of fear. In all its evolutionary history, prey animals did not make sounds like that. Prey animals did not advance when wounded. Prey animals did not meet a predator's gaze with calm, cold calculation and obvious intent to do harm. Jake took another step forward, blood from his wounds dripping onto the classroom floor but not slowing him down. His breathing was controlled, his movements deliberate. Every muscle in his body was coiled and ready like a spring under tension, waiting for the right moment to release. "Come on then," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence of the classroom. "Let's finish this." Around the room, his alien classmates watched in stunned silence. Rose had stopped crying and was staring at Jake with something like wonder in her large, flower-like eyes. Alex had ceased his panicked clicking and was motionless except for the rapid movement of his compound eyes tracking every detail of the confrontation. Even Professor Vexhar had stopped working at the control panel and was watching the human student with what appeared to be fascination. The professor's crystalline body was shifting through colors Jake had never seen before, probably processing emotions that didn't exist in the professor's peaceful species. The stalker began to circle again, but now its movements were different. Where before it had moved with the confidence of an apex predator evaluating prey, now it moved like something testing the boundaries of a potentially dangerous situation. Its head was lower, its posture more defensive. Jake turned with the creature, maintaining eye contact, keeping his body positioned to protect Rose and block the stalker's access to the other students. But his stance was no longer purely defensive. Now he was hunting the hunter, looking for an opening, waiting for the right moment to strike. The creature tried another feint, darting left as if to go around Jake, then quickly changing direction. But Jake had been watching its muscle movements, reading the subtle signs that telegraphed the creature's intentions. He was already moving to intercept before the stalker had completed its misdirection. This time, when Jake struck, it wasn't the desperate defensive blow of someone trying to survive. It was precise, calculated, and devastatingly effective. His fist caught the creature just behind its left shoulder, in a spot where Jake's xenobiology studies had taught him the nerve cluster would be located. The stalker's entire left side went numb, and it stumbled, nearly falling before catching itself. Jake didn't press the advantage immediately. Instead, he stepped back and waited, watching the creature's reaction. The message was clear. I could have finished you then, but I chose not to. What happens next is up to you. For the first time since it had been freed from containment, the stalker was beginning to understand that it might not be the most dangerous thing in the room. Jake began to move differently, shifting from foot to foot in a pattern that looked random, but was actually a form of combat footwork he had learned in his mandatory defense classes back on Earth. Every human child learned basic fighting techniques, not because Earth was a violent world, but because Earth was a world where violence was sometimes the only way to survive. The stalker tried to match Jake's movements, but it was clearly struggling to understand what was happening. Its evolutionary programming had prepared it to hunt frightened prey that would run or freeze. It had no experience with prey that fought back systematically, with intelligence and planning behind every move. Jake suddenly changed direction and advanced directly toward the creature, his arms spread wide to make himself appear larger. The stalker backpedaled, clearly unsure how to respond to such aggressive behavior from something it still thought of as a potential meal. That's right, Jake said, his voice calm and controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Back up, you're not the apex predator here anymore. The creature snarled and made another slashing attack with its claws, but now it was attacking from a defensive position, rather than an aggressive one. Jake caught the creature's front leg in both hands and used its own momentum to throw it sideways, into one of the empty desks. The desk shattered under the impact, sending pieces of synthetic material flying across the room. The stalker rolled and came back to its feet, but Jake could see it was favoring its right side now. More importantly, he could see something new in its black eyes. Doubt Jake pressed his advantage, moving forward with purposeful, measured steps. He didn't rush or charge. He advanced like someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had no doubt about the outcome. The stalker gave ground, backing toward the platform where it had first appeared. Its movements were becoming more erratic, less controlled. It was losing the psychological battle as much as the physical one. Jake, Rose whispered from behind him, her voice filled with amazement. How are you doing this? Jake didn't take his eyes off the creature, but he answered her question. On Earth, we don't get to be prey. There are things on my world that are bigger than this, faster than this, and a lot more dangerous than this. If we want to survive, we have to be willing to fight. The stalker tried one more desperate attack, launching itself at Jake with all its remaining strength. But now, Jake was ready for it. He stepped aside at the last moment and brought both hands down on the creature's back, right between its shoulder blades. The blow drove the stalker to the floor, where it lay stunned and breathing heavily. Jake stood over it, ready to strike, again if necessary, but the creature had clearly had enough. Slowly, the stalker rolled over and exposed its throat and belly in a gesture of submission that was universal among predator species. It had accepted that Jake was the dominant predator in the room. Jake nodded once, acknowledging the submission, then stepped back to give the creature space. He turned to face his classmates, who were all staring at him with expressions ranging from awe to terror to confusion. Is everyone okay? Jake asked, wiping blood from his arm with his torn shirt. The question seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the classroom. Students began moving again, talking in hushed voices, checking on each other. Rose extended one of her vine-like appendages toward Jake in what he recognized as her species' gesture of gratitude. Professor Vexhar approached carefully, giving both Jake and the now submissive stalker a wide berth. Jake, that was remarkable. How did you know to target its nerve clusters? How did you know it would respond to dominance displays? Jake shrugged, immediately regretting the movement as it pulled at his wounds. Basic biology. Most predators are also social animals with dominance hierarchies. If you can convince them you're higher up the food chain, They'll usually back down rather than risk injury fighting something more dangerous than they are. But how did you know you were more dangerous? Alex asked, his translator making his clicking sounds into words. It had claws, acid, speed, everything a perfect hunter needs. Jake looked at the Chitauri student, then at the rest of his classmates who were listening intently to his answer. Because I had something it didn't, Jake said simply. I had a choice. It was programmed by evolution to be a predator, but I chose to be one. When you choose to fight, when you decide that losing isn't an option, that gives you an advantage. That instinct can't match. The stalker, still lying on the floor in submission, made a soft whimpering sound. Jake glanced at it, then back at Professor Vexhar. The containment system should be working again soon, Jake said. When it is, this guy needs medical attention. I think I might have bruised some internal organs with that last hit. Professor Vexhar's lights flickered in what Jake had learned was amazement. You are concerned about the creature that tried to kill you? Jake nodded. It was just doing what it evolved to do. That's not its fault. Besides, it gave up and submitted when it realized it couldn't win. Honor has to be respected even in an enemy. Around the room, Jake's classmates were looking at him with new understanding. This was what it meant to be from a death world. Not just the ability to fight and survive, but the wisdom to know when to fight, when to stop, and when to show mercy. The human wasn't just a predator. He was something far more complex and far more dangerous. He was a predator with a conscience. The silence in the classroom was broken only by the soft humming of the air recycling system and the occasional whimper from the defeated stalker. Jake stood over the creature, blood slowly dripping from his wounds onto the floor, while his classmates stared at him with expressions he was still learning to read on alien faces. Professor Vexhar was the first to move, the professor's crystalline form shifting through colors Jake had never seen before. The lights inside the professor's body were pulsing in rapid, complex patterns that suggested intense thought, or possibly shock. Jake, the professor said, and Jake noticed that the wind chime quality of the professor's voice had changed, become somehow more respectful. What you just did should have been impossible. Jake looked down at the stalker, which was still lying in a submissive position but watching him with what might have been curiosity rather than fear. Why impossible? It's just basic animal psychology, mixed with some hand-to-hand combat training. Nothing fancy. Rose extended one of her flowering branches toward Jake, stopping just short of touching his wounded arm. May I ask how you learned to fight like that? On my world, we have never seen anything like it. Jake considered the question while he examined his wounds. The cuts were painful but not deep, and they had already stopped bleeding. His body's healing response was something else his classmates would probably find disturbing if they knew about it. On Earth, every kid learns basic self-defense, Jake explained. Not because we're violent, but because our world has a lot of things that can hurt you if you're not prepared. Bears, big cats, venomous snakes, sometimes other humans who aren't thinking clearly. The training isn't really about fighting. It's about staying calm under pressure and making smart decisions when something is trying to hurt you. Alex, the Chitauri student, clicked rapidly before his translator could catch up. When it did, his words came out in a rush. But how did you stay so calm? The pheromones from that creature should have triggered panic in any rational being. How? Did you override your fear response? Jake sat down heavily in the nearest unbroken chair, suddenly feeling exhausted as the adrenaline began to wear off. I was scared, he admitted. But fear is just information, like pain. It tells you something is dangerous, but it doesn't tell you what to do about it. You still have to think and make choices. Prism, the crystal student, was glowing with soft, steady light now instead of the panicked flashing from earlier. On my world, fear means you should run or hide. We do not have creatures that require fighting. That's because your world is paradise, Jake said with a slight smile. Earth is beautiful too, but it's not safe. If you want to live there, you have to be ready to defend yourself. That means learning to think clearly when you're scared, to act decisively when you're hurt, and to keep fighting even when the odds are against you. Professor Vexhar approached more closely, but Jake noticed the professor still gave the stalker a wide berth. Jake, You mentioned that this creature would be considered mid-level on Earth's threat scale. What would you consider a serious threat? Jake thought about it for a moment. Well, a grizzly bear is about 3 times the size of this thing, and a lot stronger. A saltwater crocodile has better armor and a bite that can crush bones. A tiger is faster, smarter, and more experienced at killing large prey. And those are just the obvious ones. We have tiny spiders that can kill you with one bite, fish that can electrocute you, plants that can poison you just by touching them. The classroom was completely silent now. Even the stalker seemed to be listening to Jake's casual description of Earth's dangers. But the really dangerous things, Jake continued, are the ones that are smart. Humans are the most dangerous species on Earth. Not because we're the biggest or the strongest, but because we can think our way out of almost any situation. We can work together, make tools, set traps, and plan ahead. That's why we're at the top of the food chain. Tide, the jellyfish. Student surfaced in the pool and spoke for the first time since the crisis began. The translator rendered the bubbling sounds as words. Are all humans like you? Are you all capable of this kind of fighting? Jake laughed, then immediately regretted it as the movement pulled at his wounds. I'm actually not very good at this, compared to some people. I played sports in school and took some martial arts classes, but I'm just a biology student. If you really want to see impressive fighting, you should meet someone from Earth's military or law enforcement. They train for this stuff professionally. Professor Vexhar's lights were pulsing in what Jake was beginning to recognize as deep thought. Jake, I need to ask you something important. When the stalker was loose and threatening your classmates, what went through your mind? What made you decide to intervene? Jake looked around the room at his classmates. Rose with her gentle flower-like appearance, Alex with his compound eyes reflecting rainbow patterns, Tide floating peacefully in the pool, Prism glowing with soft, harmless light. They were all so different from humans, but they were also clearly intelligent, feeling beings who had been genuinely terrified. I couldn't just let it hurt them, Jake said simply. They're my classmates. On Earth, we have a saying, the strong protect the weak. It doesn't mean the weak are inferior. It just means that if you have the ability to help someone who can't help themselves, you have a responsibility to do it. Even at risk to yourself? Professor Vexhar asked. Especially at risk to yourself, Jake replied. That's what makes it meaningful. Anyone can help when it's safe and easy. It takes courage to help when it might cost you something. Rose's petals were fully open now, their bright colors filling her section of the room with warm light. On my world, we have a concept similar to what you describe, but we have never seen it applied to other species. You risked your life for beings you barely know, who are completely different from you. That's the other thing about humans, Jake said. We're really good at expanding our definition of family. First it was just our blood relatives, then our tribes, then our nations, and now we think of all humans as one big family. I guess being around you guys, it's easy to extend that a little further. Alex was clicking excitedly. So when humans say humanity first, they do not mean humans are superior to other species? Well, some humans think that way, Jake admitted, but most of us think it means we have a responsibility to be better than our instincts tell us to be. We're predators, but we choose to be protectors instead when we can. The stalker made a soft sound and slowly rolled back onto its belly, though it kept its head low in a continued gesture of submission. Jake noticed that it was looking at him with what might have been respect rather than fear. Professor Vexhar moved to the control panel, which was finally showing green lights instead of red warnings. The containment system is back online. Jake, would you mind stepping back while I secure our guest? Jake stood and moved away from the creature, but he kept his attention on it. As the blue energy field reformed around the platform, the stalker looked directly at Jake and made a sound that was completely different from its earlier growls and hisses. It was almost like a purr, low and rhythmic. That is remarkable, Professor Vexhar said, observing the creature's behavior. It appears to be showing you respect, possibly even gratitude. Gratitude? Rose asked. But Jake defeated it in combat. Exactly, the professor replied. Jake proved he was the superior predator, but then he showed mercy when he could have finished it. In the social structure of pack hunters, that kind of behavior marks someone as a leader worthy of following. Jake looked at the stalker, which was now sitting calmly in its containment field, no longer trying to escape or attack. I think it understands that I wasn't trying to kill it, just stop it from hurting anyone. There's a difference. Yes, Professor, Vexhar agreed. And that difference is what separates a civilized being from a simple predator. Jake, what you demonstrated today was not just superior fighting ability, but superior judgment, compassion, and leadership. Alex's translator was working overtime as he clicked rapidly. Is this why humans are sought after as diplomats and peacekeepers? Because you can be dangerous when necessary but choose not to be? Jake nodded. That's probably part of it. The galaxy has plenty of species that are completely peaceful, and plenty that are naturally aggressive. But humans can be either one depending on what the situation requires. That flexibility makes us useful in complicated situations. The emergency doors finally opened with a soft hiss, and Jake could hear security teams running down the hallway toward their classroom. But the crisis was over, and everyone was safe. As medical personnel began treating Jake's wounds and behavioral specialists started working with the stalker, Professor Vexhar called for the class's attention. Students, today's lesson has been more educational than I could have planned. You have seen not just predator behavior, but the even rarer phenomenon of a predator choosing to be a protector. This is your assignment for next class. Research the concept of benevolent predation and how it might apply to interspecies cooperation. Jake smiled as the medical team finished bandaging his arm. It looked like xenobiology class was going to be more interesting than he had expected. 3 days after the incident in Xenobiology 101, Jake walked into the university cafeteria expecting the usual reaction: silence, nervous stares, and a wide circle of empty tables around wherever he chose to sit. Instead, he found Rose waiting for him at a large table near the windows, her bright petals catching the morning sunlight streaming in from Kepler Prime's twin suns. "Jake," she called out, her musical voice carrying easily across the busy cafeteria. "Over here!" Jake made his way through the crowded room, noting with surprise that other students weren't avoiding him. In fact, several nodded or made what he was learning were respectful gestures in their various cultures. A group of aquatic collective, members in their mobile water tanks even created a small light show as he passed, their version of applause. When Jake reached the table, he discovered it wasn't just Rose waiting for him. Alex was there, his compound eyes reflecting the sunlight in rainbow patterns. Prism sat nearby, glowing with soft, warm colors. Even Tide had brought a portable pool so he could join them for lunch. "This is unexpected," Jake said, setting down his tray of food. "I figured everyone would still be processing what happened in class." "We have been processing it," Alex said, his translator rendering his clicks into perfect standard Galactic. "That is exactly why we wanted to talk to you." Rose extended one of her flowering branches toward Jake's bandaged arm. "How are your injuries healing?" "Pretty well," Jake replied, flexing his arm to show the range of motion was returning. "Human healing is fairly efficient. These should be fully healed in another week or so." "Remarkable," Prism said. The crystal students' internal lights pulsing with what Jake was learning indicated fascination. "On my world, injuries like that would require months of mineral therapy to repair." Tide bubbled something that the translator rendered as, "I have been researching human biology since our class. Your species' recovery capabilities are almost as impressive as your fighting abilities." Jake took a bite of his lunch, a sandwich that was close enough to Earth food to be familiar, even if the meat came from an animal he'd never heard of. "So what did you want to talk about?" Rose's petals shifted to deeper, more serious colors. "We wanted to understand something. Why did you risk yourself for us? We are not your species, not your family, barely even your friends at that point. By all biological logic, you should have ensured your own survival first." Jake thought about the question while he ate. It was something he'd been asking himself over the past few days, trying to understand his own motivations. "I guess it comes down to how humans define family," he said finally. "Explain," Alex requested, leaning forward with interest. "For most of human history, We lived in small groups, tribes of maybe 50 to 100 people. Everyone in the tribe was family, either by blood or by choice. If the tribe was threatened, everyone fought to protect everyone else because the survival of the group meant the survival of the individual. Jake gestured around the cafeteria where dozens of different species were sharing meals and conversation. As humans spread across Earth and then out into space, we kept expanding our definition of tribe. First it was our village, then our nation, then our entire species. Some humans now think of all intelligent life as part of the same big tribe. Prism's glow shifted to warmer colors. So when you saw us in danger, your tribal instincts classified us as family worth protecting. Something like that, Jake agreed. Plus, I just couldn't stand there and watch someone get hurt when I might be able to stop it. That would have been cowardice, and cowardice is considered one of the worst character flaws in human society. But you could have been killed, Tide pointed out. How is survival considered cowardice? Jake set down his sandwich and looked at each of his table mates. Because there are things worse than death. Living with the knowledge that you could have saved someone but chose not to would be worse than dying while trying to save them. The table was quiet for a moment as the alien students processed this concept. Finally, Rose spoke up. This explains much about human behavior that has puzzled the galactic community. Your species' reputation for taking dangerous assignments, volunteering for hazardous missions, intervening in conflicts that do not directly concern you. We're not all heroes, Jake said with a laugh. Plenty of humans are selfish or cowardly, or just don't care about others, but yeah, as a species we tend to think that if you can help, you should help. Alex's translator was working overtime as he clicked rapidly. This is why humans are so effective as peacekeepers and mediators. You are willing to place yourselves at risk to protect others, even those you do not know well. That's part of it, Jake agreed. The other part is that we understand both sides of conflict. We know what it's like to be the predator and what it's like to be the prey. So we can empathize with both aggressive and defensive species. Over the next hour, the conversation ranged across topics Jake had never expected to discuss with alien classmates. They talked about human history, the concept of heroism across different cultures, and the biological basis for altruistic behavior. There is something else we wanted to tell you, Rose said as lunch period began winding down. Since the incident in class, several of us have received communications from our home governments. Jake raised an eyebrow. What kind of communications? Requests. For more information about human capabilities and psychology, Prism explained. It seems that word of what happened has spread beyond our classroom. Alex nodded. My colony's council wants to know if all humans are capable of what you demonstrated, and whether your species would be willing to train others in similar techniques. That's interesting, Jake said, though he was beginning to sense there was more to this conversation. What aren't you telling me? Tide's color shifted to what Jake had learned indicated embarrassment. There have also been inquiries about establishing formal defense agreements with Earth. Several peaceful worlds are requesting human military advisors or protection services. Jake almost choked on his drink. They want to hire humans as bodyguards? More, like guardians, Rose corrected. Species that have evolved on peaceful worlds often lack the ability to defend themselves against more aggressive cultures. Your demonstration showed that humans can be both powerful enough to deter threats and wise enough to use that power responsibly. The Galactic Council has been debating this for decades, Alex added. How to provide protection for peaceful species without creating a military caste system. Humans might be the solution they have been looking for. Jake leaned back in his chair, trying to process this information. So because I got into a fight with an overgrown lizard in biology class, the galaxy wants to turn humans into professional defenders? It is more than that, Prism said seriously. You showed mercy to a defeated enemy. You protected those weaker than yourself at personal cost. You remained calm under pressure and made ethical choices even in a life-threatening situation. These qualities are rare in the galaxy. Plus, Tide added with what might have been humor, you made it look easy. Jake laughed. Trust me, it wasn't easy. I was terrified the whole time. But you functioned despite the fear, Rose pointed out. That is what impressed everyone, not just your physical capabilities, but your mental resilience. The lunch bell chimed, signaling the end of the meal period. As students began clearing their tables and heading to afternoon classes, Jake's new friends gathered their belongings. Jake, Rose said as they prepared to leave, there is something else. Professor Vexhar has recommended you for advanced placement in several courses, including interspecies diplomacy and conflict resolution. The professor also asked me to give you this, Alex added, handing Jake a small communication device. You've been invited to speak at the next Faculty Senate meeting about human perspectives on interspecies cooperation. Jake looked at the device, then at his friends. A week ago, everyone was afraid I might eat them. Now they want me to give lectures on cooperation? Fear and respect are often confused, Prism observed. Once people understood that your dangerous qualities were balanced by wisdom and compassion, fear transformed into something much more valuable. As they walked together toward their afternoon classes, Jake reflected on how much had changed since that first day in xenobiology. He was no longer the scary human that other students avoided. Instead, he had become something he never expected, a bridge between the peaceful species and the dangerous realities of a galaxy that wasn't always safe. One more question, Jake said as they reached the intersection where their paths would diverge. What happened to the stalker? Is it okay? Rose's petals brightened with what Jake now recognized as her version of a smile. It is recovering well. Professor Vexhar says it has been remarkably calm and cooperative since the incident. The behavioral specialists think your interaction with it has actually improved its psychological health. It knows it met something worthy of respect, Alex added. That knowledge appears to have given it a sense of peace it did not have before. As Jake headed to his next class, he realized that the incident in the biology classroom had changed more than just how his classmates saw him. It had changed how he saw himself and his place in the larger galactic community. He was still just a student from Earth, but now he understood that being from a